The sun had just dipped below the horizon when a man in a black tactical vest stepped out from behind the HOA gatehouse, his hand on a pistol. My son froze in place, his baseball glove still tucked under his arm. The man barked, "Step back, kid, you're trespassing." But before I could even react, my son calmly reached into his jacket, flipped out a polished badge, and said in a steady voice, "Us federal marshal, you're the one trespassing." The man's face drained of color. In that instant, I realized the HOA had finally gone too far, and they had no idea what kind of storm they had unleashed. When my wife and I bought our house, we knew the HOA was strict. They charged high fees, policed grass height, and even demanded homeowners keep their garbage bins color-coded. But I tolerated their nonsense because my son Daniel had just returned from service overseas. He wanted a quiet place to study. Law enforcement in this neighborhood seemed peaceful enough. What none of us expected was that the HOA wasn't just strict, it was rotten to the core. The board had effectively built a little militia, calling themselves the HOA Security Force. They weren't real cops, but they wore uniforms, carried radios, and drove around in SUVs with decals that looked suspiciously like police badges. At first, it was annoying.
Ow.
They'd stop me on my way to work to ask why I left my garage open.
Oh.
They issued tickets if my truck was parked facing the wrong direction. But things escalated the night they decided to confront my son. It was a cool Friday evening. Daniel had been playing catch in the cul-de-sac with a couple of neighborhood kids. He still wore his old ball cap and that easy grin that never failed to put people at ease. That's when the so-called HOA cop rolled up. He was one of their captains, a heavy-set man with a trimmed goatee and mirrored sunglasses. Even though the sun was already down, he got out, hand on his hip, and shouted, "Y'all can't play here. This is HOA property. Move it now." Daniel, respectful but firm, replied, "With all due respect, sir, this is a public street. We're not breaking any laws." The man scowled. Then shockingly, he pulled his pistol and leveled it at my son. The neighborhood went silent. Kids dropped their gloves and bats. My heart nearly stopped, but Daniel didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a badge. "United States Federal Marshal. Lower your weapon now." The man froze. His gun wavered, then dropped toward the ground. Stammered, You can't be serious." Daniel's voice cut like steel. "Pointing a firearm at a federal officer is a felony. You're done." Within minutes, the scene turned into chaos. Some neighbors came running out with their phones, filming everything. Others shouted at the HOA cop, demanding he leave. I rushed to my son. Still shaken, but Daniel was calm, scanning the scene like he was trained to do. "Dad," he said quietly, "call the sheriff. Tell them we have an armed impersonator, threatening federal law enforcement." I didn't need to be told twice. When deputies arrived, the so-called HOA officer tried to wave them off. "This is private HOA business," he claimed. Daniel stepped forward, showed his badge, and identified himself by name and credentials. The deputy's demeanor instantly changed. They pulled the man aside, disarmed him, and placed him in cuffs. That should have been the end of it. But it was. The very next morning, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. They sent letters accusing Daniel of intimidation and fraud. They demanded he prove his law enforcement status or face fines, suspension of privileges, and possible eviction proceedings. It was laughable, except they were dead serious. My wife was terrified. She said, "They won't stop, you know. They think they own this place." Daniel just shook his head. "Then it's time someone reminds them who really enforces the law." Over. The next few weeks, Daniel quietly began investigating. He pulled property records, financial reports, and even the HOA's bylaws. What he found made my stomach turn. The HOA president, a smug man named Richard Cole, had been funneling HOA dues into a security budget. On paper, it looked like routine expenses. In reality, they were using homeowner money to buy weapons, uniforms, and even tasers, arming themselves like a paramilitary force. Worse, the captain who had pulled a gun on Daniel He had a prior conviction for aggravated assault. By law, he wasn't even allowed to carry a firearm. It was corruption on a scale we hadn't imagined. And now, with the HOA gunning literally for my family, we couldn't just ignore it. Things came to a head one Saturday. We woke to find a bright orange sticker slapped on our garage. Notice of HOA lien. They claimed we owed thousands in security violation fees. That was the last straw. Daniel walked straight to the HOA clubhouse, where the board was holding a meeting. Neighbors packed the room, whispering nervously as he stepped to the front. "Mr. Cole," Daniel said, his voice carrying through the hall, "you're under investigation for misuse of HOA funds, impersonation of law enforcement, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Cole sneered. "You think you scare us? You don't even live here. Son, you live under our rules." Daniel reached into his jacket, pulled out his badge, and held it high. "U.S. Federal Marshal. Your rules don't outrank federal law." The room erupted. People gasped, shouted, filmed on their phones. Cole turned red, sputtering, "This is harassment." Daniel's response was measured but devastating. "You had your men pointing firearms at children. You extorted homeowners under the pretense of fake law enforcement. This ends now." Within a week, the dominoes started falling. The sheriff's department raided the HOA office, seizing financial records and confiscating illegal firearms. News crews swarmed the neighborhood, broadcasting the scandal across the state. Homeowners who had lived in fear for years finally spoke up, filing lawsuits against the board. Richard Cole and his captain were both arrested. Cole for embezzlement and racketeering, the captain for weapons charges and felony assault on a federal officer. As for the HOA, it collapsed overnight. The county appointed a trustee to manage community affairs until a new association could be formed. But this time, the homeowners insisted on transparency and accountability. One evening, after the dust had settled, I sat with Daniel on our porch. The air was cool, and for once, the neighborhood was quiet. "You know," I said, "you could have just moved away. Let someone else deal with this mess." Daniel smiled faintly. "Dad, sometimes you don't get to choose the fight. Sometimes the fight comes to you." I nodded, proud beyond words. My son wasn't just brave, he was a protector. And because of him, our community was free from the HOA's tyranny. The neighborhood changed after that. People planted gardens without fear of fines. Kids played baseball in the street again. Families stopped whispering about the HOA like it was some mafia. As for Daniel, he went back to his training, focused and determined. But in the neighborhood, he was something of a legend of the Marshal who took down the HOA that thought it was above the law. And every time I look at that quiet cul-de-sac, I remember the night a gun was pointed at my son and the night he showed them all what real authority looks like. This story is just the beginning. There is so much more ahead. Subscribe to the channel to join me on this journey.